North America. It must have not been driven solely by the demands of the loss of animals and the loss of crops. There must have been an additional element, and that additional element could have been the effects of epigenetics. So we may have an answer here to why we have fascism in some parts of the world and not in others. In evolution. Terrifying implications of that. What? There's the Young and Dryas debris field. See? So that's what we're asking. No agriculture in North America? This is 12,000 years. That coincides. Coincides exactly with the rise of agricultural civilization in the West. And here is a picture of Shoemaker-Levy 9 impacting Jupiter in 1994. I was watching it because I kind of like this stuff, and there was the comet coming in, and all of a sudden it started breaking up. And no one thought it did that. We didn't know it did that. We expected it to be a big boom, but it wasn't. It started breaking up and hit Jupiter in a gazillion spots. So we're thinking that maybe the same comet from 12,800 hit the ice sheet in North America, Greenland, and many locations, and we're finding fragments of it, but we're not positive yet. I mean, until we actually find remnants of a comet, we're not positive. But it's not speculative science either. It's not settled science, but it's certainly pursued by mainstream research. Okay. The change of the world saw at this time, 11,800 years ago, was the greatest revolution we ever went through. It was the Middle East agricultural revolution, the shift from a hunter-gatherer subsistence economy to the agricultural surplus economy. You don't love this. Obviously, the changes in human behavior and additions of new intelligences that took place at this time must be referred to the environmental changes that called them into being, but this cannot be the whole story. Profound epigenetic effects must also evolve in us to support the new agricultural behaviors. And I think this is where the psychology of obedience as a social psychology first emerged in the human record. But where does fear? Because we started with Reich telling us that the authoritarian has a kind of fearfulness of freedom, but Reich doesn't tell us where that evolved, how that happened in the human record. Why would that evolve in the human mind? Why would you become afraid of being alive? What? That's insane. I think the answer begins with the trauma of fear of starvation. Following the Young and Dryas impact, it must have affected large populations. Hunter-gatherers in North America returned to their former lifestyles, but this was not the case in the Middle East. But why not? The Mississippi River Valley in North America could have supported an agricultural revolution, just as did the Fertile Crescent of the Tigris and Euphrates right there at Anatolia in southern Turkey. But it didn't happen. But we have earthworks. They were fooling around in the Mississippi River. They didn't create agriculture. So there's more than just exigencies. Requirements of daily living after the impact were involved in the rise of agriculture. It didn't have to happen. In the Middle East, I think epigenetic evolution brought new intelligence and behaviors that led to the agricultural civilization. We do not know why populations took the evolutionary turn to agricultural civilization in the Middle East, but they did, and is my starting point. See that? See how far we've changed just in my lifetime. All of these discussions in my lifetime were governed by the rule of gradualism. Human beings started out as Homo erectus 2 million years ago, and we made fire, and we had tools, and everything gradually evolved, and bit, and we are replacing gradualism with catastrophism, that the human record is punctuated by a series of catastrophes that kick into play another form of evolution that's not gradualistic but dramatic. And now we're in a whole different way of thinking. Then the thinking from the beginning of my life to now is a sea change, multiple, tons of sea changes. We must think our way into the setting of the fear of extinction from starvation after the Young and Dryas comet impact and ask how assertion declined and obedience to agricultural regimens arose. After all, agriculture takes a lot of obedience. You gotta work on that row of crops, and you gotta collect them, and you gotta plant them. And how did the fearfully dependent mind of domination evolve in this setting? The answer is that there's a hitch in evolving to non-assertiveness. The demands of survival call up self-direction in us, and in this way, fear of extinction is cut back as we learn our way into new individualized thinking and behaviors and renew our self-confidence. I'm scared. There was food here, now there's not. I didn't come into this environment just blind. I came in following game, I came in following stuff I could eat, and roots and berries, but now, boom, I can't find anything, and I'm getting weaker, and I'm terrified of starving. Now, in the normal course of things, as I become more using my natural resources for individualized response and self-direction, and it gives me the confidence that I don't have to be so afraid. So I'm thinking that autonomy and self-direction and lessening of fearfulness are inversely related. So correspondingly, the loss of capacity for self-directed discovery means rising fear. I think this is what happened. Self-directedness began to exhaust itself in us as we were failing in the struggle against starvation, and we began to look to obedience as the path to survival. Self-direction gets in the way of obedience, and so self-direction became associated with starvation, and we came to fear it by association as we feared starvation. At first, perhaps, we looked upon obedience as magical thinking, that we would not starve, because somehow obedience contained the elusive answer we had not found in relying on our own individual resourcefulnesses. What started as magical thinking became real. We evolved into obedience, maybe at first obeying with no actual showing that obedience could assure survival, but then little by little it began to, and we ended up creating agricultural society with its many levels of obedience. There's no other way that could happen. How could we go from a hunter-gatherer civilization of independent, individualized experiences to an obedient, authoritarian civilization? Boom! That could not have happened by any gradualistic method overnight, because it did. Hunter-gatherers were right there on the scene at the time of the impact crater, and in 1,000 years they're gone, and there's agriculture. It's not possible. We had to have had epigenetic mechanisms kick in to reinforce the step away from reliance, individualization, autonomy, and enforce the mind of obedience. But here's the problem. Here's the heart of my reconstruction. Because we did not recover the capacity of self-direction, we continued to carry the fear of starvation. And it is still undergirding obedience to authority even today. The agricultural civilization is here at every moment. All wealth of our entire civilization is agriculture. Starvation is not a danger, but self-direction is atrophied in us, and we are impotent in a way, and we have no way to face anything as individuals, and are afraid because we cannot and crave obedience to authority. So at first we associated fear of starvation with self-direction, and now self-direction has become atrophied in us so that any demand that would require it is frightening to us because we cannot address it. Because we know we can't. We've lost our ability for individualized experience, and we're clinging to obedience. Now everything is scaring us. The whole world frightens us. The world is chaos, and God is insane, as Thomas Saz has observed. The mind is full of craving for obedience. And all this is now epigenetically encoded into agricultural civilization. But I think it all began with fear of starvation in the wake of the Young-Dryas comet impact, leading to the rise of agricultural civilization. I have a thesis, that's it, that Reich's fear of freedom starts as fear of starvation, and then lingers because we never overcome it the way they did in North America by recovering their natural capacities for self-direction and beating out that fearfulness. We didn't. Instead, we obeyed. And that atrophied self-direction, and now that fearfulness is still with us, and now that is the psychology of fascism. Just anecdotally, I recently read an interesting experiment a few years ago that showed up that Until about the age of 2, chimpanzees infants significantly outperform human infants in problem solving because of their greater capacity for individualized and independent thinking. But then human infants turn to socialized learning and begin to outperform the chimps. The experiment did not cite from which populations the human infants were chosen, and I suspect that the difference is due to comparative epigenetic evolution, and the results might be comparatively different with a different human population. I'll bet you that if you put up chimps against populations of infants that were not subject to the trauma of the comet impact, populations in tropical refuges, they might hold up very well against the chimps because they are still capable of independent and autonomous thinking. Whereas we, descended in that population, from that epigenetic coding, have lost it. In the tradition from Freud, life just originally is sexuality anonymized. Going along with individualization is a creative act of life becoming, and life becoming is an orgasmic function in a fundamental way. Before Freud, we find this analysis of life in terms of the orgasmic in Nietzsche, in respect to life becoming more in the sense of adding to itself. He says that the will to power in life is a will to mere Leben. Life seeks to overcome resistances to itself, and becoming more is a feeling of happiness. He uses the term Mehrgefühl, Machtgefühl, Kraftgefühl for this happiness, and I think it is fundamentally orgasmic. Nietzsche's interest in the myth and cult of Dionysus must be referred to this. His idea of the feeling of happiness in the development of life in mere Leben as a basic life function is best analyzed as Reich's idea that life is orgasmic. Reich was a therapist trying to treat people. He developed a sex therapy for the authoritarian personality. He so believed that it was the source of the problem. I'm not concerned with weighing in on the results of his therapy one way or another, but I agree with his psychological insights into orgastic impotence in authoritarian civilization because of fearfulness of freedom. In the mass psychology of fascism, Reich brilliantly analyzed flag and fire symbolism in the Nazi torchlight processions as cathected with fear of the free play of life in orgasm, and he revealed the sexual meaning of the swastika and other features of fascism. His point, this is Freudianism, his point, terrifying in its implications for mass psychology, was that orgastic impotence leads to a buildup of libido, which, as it does so more and more, becomes increasingly frightening and leads to increasingly perverse displacements. The orgasmic in self-direction is now frightening. But it makes no sense at all to make sexual dysfunction a starting point, as do Freud and Reich. It must be grounded in evolution. And that can only mean epigenetic evolution in the aftermath of cataclysmic trauma, induced in some populations but not others. The weakness, and this is where I'm trying to go beyond the Marx-Freud synthesis, the weakness of classical Freudianism is that the Oedipus complex is not universal. The ethnographic work of Bronislaw Malinowski soon showed up this weakness in Freud's thinking. The advent of the science of comparative evolution solves the problem. So I think the correct reconstruction of Western authoritarianism and the orgastic impotence because of fear of freedom, as Wilhelm Reich was studying, begins with the fear of starvation, fear of extinction in the aftermath of the Young Dryas comet impact. Gradually, as epigenetic Lamarckian evolution kicked in to recover from it, acts of self-direction became associated with fear of extinction from starvation, since self-direction gets in the way of obedience, which began to emerge as the pathway to survival. These effects did not appear in populations in tropical refugia that continued along the Darwinian trajectory, such as in the South Sudan, and its political economy there remained acephalous. There's a Nuer youth from the South Sudan. They have no laws, no leaders, they are an anarchic society. How is this happening? And the answer, well, look at where they are on the map. They're in a tropical refuge. They're not affected by these environmental traumas. It's just impossible. Now that we really begin to understand epigenetics, the answer to why human beings are so dramatically different is not going to be, well, we had progress and all this other crap. It's going to be because they're exposed to different environmental circumstances dramatically, and that talking about one is progress and one lack of progress is just utter nonsense. And the only meaningful way to talk is we have competencies of some sort and competencies of different sorts and under different environmental conditions, and they are all good, except when they're not. And we need to get rid of the parts that are bad. So somehow in the mind of that person, there is no craving for authority. And it's in his epigene, and we need to find it, and we need to take Donald Trump's epigene and make Donald Trump's epigene match it. If life just is originally sexuality anonymized, it would explain why the threat of castration lies at the foundation of agricultural culture, as Freud recognized in Civilization and its Discontents. This is Marcuse's theme in Eros and Civilization. The study of family and private property as having its origins in domination psychology is fascinating, and I refer readers to Marx's associate and sometimes collaborator Friedrich Engels' classic work, The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State. In the final structuring of Western authoritarianism, the threat against self-direction become frightening as leading to extinction became the threat of castration by the authoritarian father. Authoritarianism cannot construct self-direction face-to-face, and it is defaulted to the ulterior threat of castration. The connection between the two is that the fundamentally orgasmic character of everything life does, and that includes self-direction. Everything life does is orgasmic. Self-direction is one of those things, and the authoritarian attack upon self-direction, that is the answer to why the authoritarian attack on self-direction takes this bizarre sexual turn as it does in Freud, and why the threat of the authoritarian father to do what you're told becomes the threat of castration, because obedience, because not doing what you're told is orgasmic. Everything life is, in some very fundamental, very, very, very basic level. That's what life is. It looks like what is happening is that a certain population drove its epigenetic adaptations in the wake of a climactic disaster, always brilliant adaptations, and overflowing with new intelligences to become the dominant culture worldwide. But those adaptations conserved the imprint of the trauma, not so much repairing it as like a tree growing up around an embedded rock. Domination of the refractory other is an effect of trauma, conserved by epigenetic mechanisms from that time, and will take epigenetic reversal to reset this trajectory of our evolution. Perhaps the most important self-other deconstruction is to deflate the idea that Middle Eastern civilization represented progress over the resumption of hunter-gatherer culture in North America, where Darwinian mechanisms continued to predominate. This is just such fascinating stuff. It's only showed up in the last few years. Reich takes us beyond Freud, but now that epigenetics has emerged, we can reread Nietzsche in this light. His contribution should enter into the great synthesis of political economy and evolutionary psychology we have been working on. The study of Nietzsche begins with the study of his autobiography, Ecce Homo. He says so, at any rate. Philosophers say, oh, Nietzsche was not necessarily in the best position to understand his philosophy. And what I've done a very good job in 40 years of ignoring the Nietzsche scholars. Trust me. Nietzsche wrote Ecce Homo to be the introduction to what was to be his Hot Work, a 4-volume systematic presentation of his thinking titled The Revaluation of All Values. He says that in the revaluation of values to come, he will set before humankind the heaviest demand that has ever been made upon it, and that because he will do so, it is needful first to say who he is, whence the necessity to write Ecce Homo, which means, here I am. The heaviest demand Nietzsche planned to set before us was the demand that humanity overcome itself. But this idea has a specific constant value in his thinking. He means the overcoming of what he called the Lebensfeindliche tendenz. Lebensfeindlich, Leben is life, feindlich is enmity, is the state of enmity. So Lebensfeindlich means a tendency toward hatred of life. Tendency toward the hatred of life that characterizes nihilistic religions such as Christianity and Buddhism. Various movements in art and music, such as Wagner, in literature of romantic pessimism, and in Western philosophy, Socrates to Schopenhauer. The Lebensfeindlich tendenz is not a source of fascism. Nietzsche is not connected to fascism or the study of it. And I wouldn't want to be thought to be saying that Nietzsche was doing that, and he was certainly no Marxist. Nonetheless, I think he should be brought into the Marx-Freud synthesis. I'll tell you why. The starting point Nietzsche presents in Ecce Homo is inheritance from his father, who is not who Nietzsche is, but the opposition he faced in becoming who he is. What happened? My reading is that Nietzsche inherited an epigenetic regulation from his father that allowed him to engage the wider, historically conserved epigenetic profile coding for the Lebensfeindliche tendenz in a species-wide, though not universally. Nietzsche's father died at the age of 36 from brain disease. Brain diseases of the sort being speculated on are not heritable, but it's likely that Carl Nietzsche suffered from psychological trauma as his brain disease progressed, and that trauma had an effect on his epigene that Nietzsche then inherited. Nietzsche does state that because of what he inherited from his father, he was in a position to revalue all values, and that can only mean being in the position to reverse the historically conserved profile of the epigenetic coding for the vengeful hatred of life in Christian culture. Something in the epigenetic overlap of inheritance from his father made it possible for something personal and sui generis in him to become the world historical for him. Nietzsche wrote Ecce Homo to report on his own self-overcoming of the Lebensfeindliche tendenz, but as it afflicts the wider population conserved from the ancestral past. He believed in the overhuman, and he knew that he himself was summoning him by his regimens of self-overcoming. My books speak only of my self-overcomings, he said, and line by line they present the creation of ein moreness of life in relation to the Lebensfeindliche, the hatred of it. I believe his claim that he did evolve himself out of a historically conserved adverse epigenetic profile, and I don't know of anyone else who has done that, nor did he, and that makes him relevant to us. Nietzsche's work on within himself, overcoming the Lebensfeindliche tendenz, is analogous to what we've been saying about fascism. It's as if we had a guy who said, yes, I am afraid of freedom, and came along and said, here's how I fought it in myself, and in fighting it in myself, I'm engaging the epigenetic profile from 12,000, 800 years ago. Because that's what Nietzsche did, which is extraordinary. We can do that? That's what Nietzsche said he was doing. In Voraussicht, dass ich das in Kurzem mit einer schwersten Forderung an der Menschheit hinanzutreten muss, scheint es mir unverlässlich zu sagen, wer ich bin. Seeing that in a short time I have to confront humanity with the heaviest men that have been set before it, it seems to me that it cannot be set aside who I am. I am the individual who has engaged a historically conserved, perverse epigenetic profile from origins I don't know, and I changed it, and I have become the forerunner of overhumanity. Sadly, Nietzsche's program is not permitted to initialize. The evolutionary development of the overhuman about which he spoke was to begin with changes wrought at the level of the individual. What have you done to overcome the overhuman, to overcome man? These individual changes, he has the idea, will consolidate in a forward inheritance channel and lead to the overhuman. Well, calling for a culture of individuality in the authoritarian social order of the Germany of his day was not cautious. And institutionalized psychology, the organ of social control, kicked in, and Nietzsche was put in a mental institution for 16 months, forcibly drugged. I feel like I am being continuously poisoned, he was reported to have said at the Jena Clinic for the Care and Cure of the Insane. That's probably what Nietzsche's cell looked like. 16 months, Friedrich Nietzsche in a cell like this. Are you nuts? Off his medication, he would lapse back into a pattern of laughter and crying out of control. Clear indices of insanity, surely, or were they the marks of the hyperclarity of China's Bada Shanran that say all that can be said? His project of evolution, in which the individual is the locus of development, cannot start before and apart from a successful confrontation with authority. These points are my grounds for including him in the Marx-Freud synthesis despite his antipathy toward Marxism. I think Nietzsche's development of life in himself as per the Lebensfeindliche tendenz is the one hopeful piece we have, and maybe we can learn its lesson and adopt them to addressing authoritarianism. And that's my paper.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. And now we have about a half hour to discuss with
Excellent.
yeah,
Here's some
professor.
screens from of current post-feminist books. This is a book I just reviewed for Philosophy in Review by Professor Francesca Frondo of NYU. The review will come out in a couple of months. And this is our next Beyond Humanism conference, will be in Greece in July. So I'll be presenting something there. I don't know what, I haven't written it yet. That's next on my... Okay, well, there you go. This is as far as 70 years of thinking has gotten me. It really is.
Okay, if someone have some thoughts or some questions, or maybe the question for about the Nietzsche or something like that, just don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
No, but this is Western critical philosophy. You're supposed to answer me questions, and I'm supposed to be able to answer them. That's what we do.
Yeah.
So when I'm in Europe, trust me, my colleagues are not sparing. That's what we do. There must be something scary or scary. They're very different, beyond the philosophy of good and evil.
Honestly, I never link the Nietzsche and the
No.
Marxist
No one would.
before see this paper. So
You wouldn't, because it's only because it looks like Nietzsche was the first guy to have stumbled onto epigenetic mechanisms and to figure out how to. That's what he says he's doing. I'm reversing something in myself that I inherited from my father. That's what it says. And it can't be just a personal, but that's the thing. Well, he's crazy. Well, maybe he wasn't crazy. How's that? Maybe he wasn't. He could only be saying that if something about the inheritance from his father made it possible for him to engage an epigenetic profile that is in us species-wide. And I don't know how that mechanism would work. We're still studying epigenetics. This is epigenetics. Look, in order, the DNA is, when cells divide, organizes itself into a nanowire called chromatin. Chromatin is a strand of DNA wrapped around a molecular core of molecules called histone. The strand of DNA will wrap around a histone molecule, maybe 150 pairs will wrap around each histone molecule, and then there'll be a strand of linker DNA, and then wrap around another core of histone molecules, and so on for all 3 billion base pairs. So like a string that's wrapping around a series of pearls. There is an electrostatic connection. I think it works this way, that DNA is overall negatively charged, and these histone cores, the molecule of histone that is wrapped around, is positively charged. Here's how epigenetics works. When a gene-bearing section of DNA is shut down, the histone molecule will recruit methyl from the cytoplasm of the cell, and the more tight positive charge will bond the DNA around the histone molecule, and it cannot uncoil. What happens is the histone molecule has to uncoil in order for RNA to split it and transcribe it, and then eventually translate what it is coding into a protein. That process can't happen. So what we're learning is this very delicate mechanism of how the chemicals repress certain genes, and that can be changed. So Pfizer, for example, our chemical company, has a drug that will enter the nucleus of the cell on a molecular level and prevent the histone molecule from recruiting methyl, so that the gene wrapped around it will express. And that particular gene, it turns out, is necessary to control cell reproduction and is curing cancer. So we have, this stuff is working. But the mystery that we're only beginning to think about is, how can any of this has to be the story of the human race, is epigenetic control, and we're just beginning to talk about epigenetic evolution. That's what Peter Ward is, that changes everything.
Hi. This reminds me your last presentation in the summer of 2017.
Yes.
It's about